Welcome everyone back to the Real News Network. Again, I'm Jared Ball here in Baltimore, and we're continuing our conversation with University of Pennsylvania professor and political scientist, Professor Adolph Reed. Dr. Reed, again, welcome back to the Real News.
That's always my pleasure. Thank you very much.
So as I was sort of wrapping up there in the end of that last segment, I know that you were one of the early critics in 2007, if not earlier, of the rise, seemingly out of nowhere, of Barack Obama. And his representation of neoliberalism wrapped up in seemingly progressive politics. And I recognize that there are differences between his campaign and the Bernie Sanders campaign, important differences at that. But I'm wondering if the ultimate same point isn't still there, that Bernie is asking people to come right back to the Democratic Party apparatus. In fact, he makes it part of his campaign platform to say we need people who are not already wedded to the system to come into the process to get him elected. Isn't this also, again, similar to your criticism that we're going to talk here about in just a moment of reparations, that it's another sort of capitalistic, market-based solution to the world's problems, and that Bernie is ultimately, while critical of Wall Street and critical of the banks, not a real socialist in that he's calling for a breakup of the bank or a seizure of the banks, and a full redistribution of wealth. So as sort of a segue to get to reparations, could we start with that response or critique?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I say this about, actually my criticism of Obama goes back to 1995. I mean, I just happened, I've been saying to people lately that, I just happened to be in the birthing room at the outset of his political career. So I got to see the act very early on. And I was not alone. I mean, people who paid attention saw that, this guy was like a neoliberal confection, basically. In fact, I wrote that in late 1995. So, I mean, that's a tremendous difference, right? But look, here's the thing about the Sanders campaign. I think we have to start out from an assumption, a premise, that there is no left that exists as a viable force in American politics. So if Sanders were inclined, and I don't know that he is, I don't know that he isn't, but if he were inclined to try to run on a platform of expropriating the expropriators, then he would have as much support as those Trotskyist candidates who get 200 votes in every election, right? And that speaks back to what I was saying in the first segment, that part of what's going on here is a movement building exercise or campaign. And part of what that is establishing or shifting the center of gravity of political discourse in American life. So that for the last 25 years, if not longer, it's been impossible, right, to talk about controlling financial capitalism, to talk about making the kind of public investments that we need to make to make this a decent society, even to defend the idea of the public. In fact, I'm thinking, once I clear some other stuff off my desk, I want to write a little essay about this on the notion of doing more with less as the root of the democratic, capital D, the democratic version of neoliberalism, because it's a fiction. And that Sanders is rejecting that fiction. The Sanders campaign is rejecting that fiction. And what it's arguing for is a view, a conviction that the federal government should be, and federal policy should be oriented primarily to addressing the needs and concerns and the security, and not just military security, but I mean economic security, job security, personal security of the vast majority of people who live in this country, those of us who are expected to work for a living. And that's a fundamental difference between Sanders and Clinton and like anybody else running as a Democrat. I've heard some of old people like me with long memories compare his campaign to the Eugene McCarthy campaign in 1968, where a slogan was actually to take protest out of the streets and bring it back into the Democratic Party. Well, the historical circumstance is fundamentally different, right? There is no movement out there, right? And So this campaign, win, lose, or draw, and as far as I'm concerned, it's already like for this at this point already like we're playing with house money in this thing. I mean, this campaign has already made inroads into changing the terms of political debate, which is the important first step.
Well, okay, as sort of a segue to this conversation about reparations, one of you were quoted recently in making a statement about the importance of unions, saying that despite the fashionability of protests without any specific demands or elected leaderships, no movement initiative is going to have staying power without being anchored in the trade unions.
Right.
And it was part of a conversation you were having about the union support of Bernie Sanders. Mm-hmm. Well, so I mean, Bernie doesn't have the trade union support that he would need to make your statement viable. Isn't that correct? I mean,
Well, he's got.
But then also, but just to complete this segue, so we can actually do this little thing about reparations. My real question is isn't this leading us all back to the same, again, as you were pointing out in terms of reparations, market-based solutions, absent the kind of movement necessary to make even a Sanders campaign viable or powerful, as many would hope it will be, even if he's elected as president? If you could use a response to that to tell us a little bit why you have this critique of reparations and support him despite his refusal to engage that particular question of reparations for African descendants in this country.
Right. Yeah. No. It's good actually because I've been wanting to have an opportunity to answer a question, which is, and the question that I've seen flying around a lot is, and it's not just about me, but others who have made this point. That it's dishonest, even some people have said, to reject the demand for reparations as unrealistic, while accepting a demand for single-payer health care, which is also unrealistic. And I would say this, that they are both certainly unrealistic demands for the next Congress. Right, for the next 2 years, or maybe the next 4 years, right, for all we know, because the composition of Congress obviously would have to change, for us to get anything through. But here's what's the crucial difference. And my question about the reparations thing has been the same since it got put back on the public agenda at the beginning of the century. The question is, how can you imagine fashioning a political alliance that could prevail on this issue? And it seems to me it's a lot easier to imagine where the constituency or the constituencies for a political alliance around single-payer healthcare could come from than it is to imagine how a broad enough alliance could be put together in defense, in support of the pursuit of reparations to prevail on that issue. Because the problem is that in a majoritarian electoral system, that that's how you got to get this stuff through. Like, unless we have like a post-Black Power fantasy of Black workers taking the lead and getting 5 states or enacting a putsch basically. So that's what I think the crucial difference is.
Well, just very quickly, what then of the argument that to build this real coalition, shouldn't those on the left look to develop that kind of movement by perhaps even coalescing to form a new party or a real opposition in the electoral political realm, or the kind of movement that might even push, admittedly, it's far more of a fantasy for me to consider this, but push a Democratic Party candidate to actually be able to push this through. So in other words, if there was a real left movement that coalesced around a genuine redistribution of wealth, then the reparations argument, and this is where I think I would agree, could be expanded to say, look, African descendants deserve reparations clearly, as do many other groups for various reasons. So why don't we just have sort of a collective reparations movement, so to speak, that deals with the American white worker, the Latino or Chicano immigrant, the African descendant, all of the indigenous population, all of these coalesce around a true left alternative oppositional effort. Why wouldn't that be more of why wouldn't that be a preferable course to take for those on the left than rallying behind this Bernie Sanders campaign?
Well, look, in the first place, there isn't that that a movement out there, right? I mean, so that's one thing,
No, so I'm saying I'm advocating that we create one.
and my argument is that I think the Sanders campaign is an important step in the direction of creating one, right? As to the reparations frame for all that, well, I mean, my question would be, or my response would be, that it's a premise that we don't need, right? Like we don't need to couch the demand for justice and equality in the language of payback, right? Which opens up to all other kinds of petty kind of debates, but just say this is the kind of society that we want now, punto. Because I agree with you. I mean, like and I think that's another limit of the reparations frame, that once you start talking about, once you try to justify demands for justice in the present on the basis of suffering in the past, well, everybody suffered in the past. So like then you get into that Oprah Winfrey kind of debate about who suffered more. And, my great grandparents never owned any slaves and they came here without a pot to piss in, right? And so forth and so on. I mean, you don't need it, right? I mean, like you don't need it. So the question that I would have for the advocates of reparations is, what is it that's so appealing, either emotionally or politically, about the trope of reparations, even when it appears to be like an unnecessary and maybe even a counterproductive frame of reference to try to force affirmative struggles for justice in the present into. And I think that there's a commitment, but I think I think it stems from a different kind of political commitment, basically.
Well, Adolph Reed, it's always a pleasure to catch up with you. We thank you very much for joining us here at The Real News. Look forward to many more conversations with you here and elsewhere. But thanks again for joining us.
Oh, hey, man, my pleasure, Jared, always. Take care, man.
And thanks to all of you for joining us here at The Real News. And as always, again, I'm Jared Ball and here in Baltimore saying, as Fred Hampton used to say, to you we say peace if you're willing to fight for it. So peace, everybody, and we'll catch you in the whirlwind.